not bad, considering the amount of currency we printed. I think it's also interesting that the United States has not sold an ounce since 1980. So for 30 years, we've held on to our gold. Our ratio is low, but it's not crazy. It's not far different than where it was at times past. I think we're on a shadow gold standard anyway, but your average central banker really can't talk about that. Okay, now interesting phenomenon. Take the 16 members of the Euro system and combine them. This is what you get. Europe, on a united basis, has 10,000 tons. So actually more than the United States. Now, obviously, Europe's got a lot of problems. But again, I like that combination of Europe, United States, IMF. You're looking at over 2/3 of the world's gold. And the pygmies are places like Russia and China. Same thing on a bar graph, again, illustrates the dominance of the major Western powers. This is gold reserves as a percentage of total reserves. Now, reserves can be in gold or they can be in hard currency. So I can have yen, sterling, Swiss francs, euros. Those can all be in my reserves. Now, what's interesting is that the United States, we're not on the gold standard, right? 72% of our reserves are in gold. We don't hold reserves in other people's paper money. We hold it in gold. I threw Greece in there for fun. Greece's problem is their total reserve position is minuscule. They happens to be 75% of it's in gold, but don't think that their reserves are anything like the United States. But look at our friends Germany, Italy, and France. This is a legacy of, not of World War I, by the way. This is the gold. In 1950, the United States had 20,000 tons. By 1970, we had 9,000 tons. Those 11,000 tons in that 20-year period went from the United States to Europe because they ran trade surpluses. We had trade deficits. That was all part of getting Europe going again after World War II. And the point is, in those days, when you had a trade surplus, you cashed in your bucks and you got gold. And that's how they did it. Charles de Gaulle, remember, sent a French destroyer to New York to pick up their gold at one point in the 1960s. And that's when Nixon kind of had second thoughts. But now, the same thing happened between China and the United States between 1990 and 2010 as happened between Germany, France, and the Netherlands and the United States between 1950 and 1970. China ran the surplus. We ran the deficit. But this time, they didn't get any gold. They got paper. So, when Secretary Geithner talks about rebalancing as between consumption and investment, the Chinese, I talked to government officials in China, they're sitting there saying, wait a second, we never got the gold that Germany and France, and we got this paper, and it's a problem for us, and indeed it is. So this is, I did the doom and gloom part, but this is kind of where America, I think, has got some trump cards. This is gold as a percentage of your GDP. So let's relate gold at market prices to your economy. Now here, the United States does well, but not as well as Germany and France. Germany and France actually step up significantly ahead of us in terms of how much gold they have relative to economic activity. And again, I love Canada. Canada's a good gold producer. They have no gold in their reserves. I don't know what they did with it. But China looks very weak on a relative basis. So, let me just wrap up by saying gold has been associated with 2 very long periods of prosperity and rising living standards. Now, in a deflationary crisis, now go back to what I said earlier about the currency wars. What are you doing in a currency war? You're devaluing against the other guy. But that's temporary and it can't last, and everybody can't devalue against everybody else. So what do you do when you're the strong hands? You're the United States of America, right? Everybody wants to devalue against you because they want to export to you, but we're stuck. President Obama said he'd like to double exports in 5 years. So good luck if your dollar's strong, right? You need a weak dollar to do that. What happens when you can't devalue against the other guy and you're stuck and you're still not growing and you need those net exports? Your devaluation numeraire of last resort is gold. And this has happened twice. President Roosevelt did it in 1933 and 1934. He confiscated the gold of U.S. citizens. You actually, if you had a safe deposit box, they sealed your safe deposit box. You had to make an appointment with an IRS agent who would meet you at the bank. They would unseal your box, open it. If there was gold in it, the IRS would take the gold and give you a receipt. And Fort Knox was built to hold all the gold. The Treasury had a problem. They collected so much gold, confiscated, not confiscated, but it's kind of taken in at a cheap price, put it that way. They had so much gold that they took from the American people that Fort Knox was built as a depository to hold the gold because they didn't know where to put it. Fort Knox opened in 1937. And so, but Roosevelt took the gold at $20 and then repriced it to 35. So the United States Treasury got the 15 delta, not the American people. But it was a way to cheapen the dollar. When you couldn't cheapen it against the pound or the French franc or the German mark or the Japanese yen at the time, the president devalued it against gold, and that caused some inflation and got commodity prices up. President Nixon did the same thing in 1971. Again, another currency war where sterling broke in 67. The German mark was actually strong. That was going up. France wanted to devalue. England wanted to devalue. And Nixon wanted to devalue. And there was a limit on that, so he devalued against gold, and gold between 1971 and 1981 went from $35 an ounce to $800 an ounce. So that was actually very successful. So this is a bipartisan policy. We have Democrats and Republicans kind of willing to work together to debase the dollar. And that's, so anyway, kind of putting all this together, right? Bernanke's trying to inflate to make there's too much debt, it can't be repaid. One way to repay it is to debase the currency. The way to do that is inflation. Bernanke's trying to inflate. He's not getting the inflation because we're in a currency war with China, which we're losing at the moment. So when push comes to shove, at the end of the day, the United States will play its trump card, which is gold. We'll go back to a gold standard at something like $5,000 an ounce because that's highly inflationary, which is what we want after all. That's one way to cheapen the dollar 80%. With snap of your fingers, just go to $5,000 gold, and that will solve the problem, and we'll pay back the Chinese $1 trillion in tokens. So I know that sounds glib, but it's actually the history of the 20th century. The two currency wars, 1922 to 1936, 1967 to 1985 with the Plaza Accords. Both times we devalued against gold as our way out of the problem. In 1930s, the problem was debt from World War I. In the 1970s, the problem was debt from two wars, Vietnam and the war on poverty. We've got a couple of wars going on now, and the problem is actually worse. So what do we do? I think from the military perspective, you're going to see increasing civil disorder around the world. We're always seeing that. There's confusion, fear, and anxiety, dynamic instability, a lot of political backlash. One of the things that concerns me the most is we have no dry powder. People defending current fiscal policy say, you know what, the U.S. has a high debt to GDP ratio, but it's no higher than it was in 1945. And that's true, but I'm like, yeah, but in 1945, we fought and won World War II. It was an existential crisis, and we emerged as the sole superpower. We had to share the stage with Soviet Union a little bit, but we were so dominant at that point. We actually got something for our money. It wasn't a monetary exercise, but we got something for that debt. We won the war. Now we've got the same debt level, but we haven't won any wars. I mean, we're not any world wars. We're not the hyperpower we were in 1945. So I'm not sure what we got for our money, number one. Number two, we're now non-robust to catastrophe. What if we do have a war? What if we have a natural disaster orders of magnitude greater than Katrina? What if we have something where you say, you know what, an enlightened solution now would be to print some money. Like that would actually be a good reason to print money because we need to find a way out of this catastrophe. Well, we already did that. We already printed all this money, so I'm not sure we can print $3 trillion more. Just to summarize quickly, in extremis, and I emphasize the term in extremis, the president has extraordinary, I would say dictatorial powers, totally legal, totally constitutional, under the International Economic Emergency Powers Act of 1977, enacted during the Carter administration. It's been used time and time again. But if confronted with a national security crisis with an international aspect, and this would certainly qualify, the president can, as I like to say, seize, freeze, and don't say please. He could actually, we could send Special Operations Command, and I actually think the military should be thinking about this in contingency space. You could send a contingent to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, confiscate the gold. There's 6,000 tons buried underneath the Fed in New York. That's not our gold. That gold belongs to the rest of the world, but you could seize that gold, move it up to West Point. The U.S. at that point would have 14,000 tons. We could then start a new global currency, a new global dollar, if you will, controlled by us, backed by gold, acceptable to trade counterparts, get the economy moving again. So if you see, I think one of the reasons Bernanke may feel comfortable playing with fire is the fact that if the paper dollar collapses, we have a plan B. We have a plan B, which is to go back to gold. China has no plan B. Russia has no plan B. So we would be in a dominant relative economic position if the worst happens. So let's kind of be attentive to that. But I think that kind of contingency planning to move the foreign gold to West Point, give the Europeans a receipt, like a due bill, so you can restart the system would be a good idea. So let me finish. So here's Unified Quest 2011. So the Army's website. They are going to do a scenario of economic collapse. They're not really going to do the economics of it. They're going to kind of presuppose the collapse and then talk about operations inside the homeland to restore civil order. That's kind of, I think, good thinking ahead. And let me just end with one last clip, and then we'll go to questions. By the way, this is fictional. This is the last two I showed you were like straight news, no embellishment. This is a movie from 1981, Hume Cronin, Chris Christopherson, Jane Fonda, called Rollover, but shows you how some things never change.
For paper money that is worthless.
When the Arabs learned that word of what they've been doing is out, they may panic. Move a big chunk of funds too fast or the wrong way. Really destabilize the monetary markets. Then the dollar will collapse. Whereupon there'll be a lot of jawboning by the president, and that won't work. Then they'll go to selling gold, and that won't work either. Then they'll have to go to capital controls, freeze foreign assets, stop any money from going in or out, and that will be the end of all the markets. That'll really be the finish. Then you'll see a worldwide depression that'll make the 1930s look like a kindergarten. In 2 months, you'll have bread lines in Detroit, riots in Pittsburgh. In 6 months, you'll see grouse right over Rodeo Drive, and Michigan Boulevard, and Fifth Avenue, and I won't have done it, Hub. You will. All because you tried to stop a movement that couldn't be stopped anyway. Listen to me, Hub. Money, capital, has a life of its own. It's a force of nature, like gravity, like the oceans. It flows where it wants to flow. This whole thing with the Arabs and gold is inevitable. We're just going with the tide. The only question is whether you want to let it go like an unguided missile and raise hell, or whether you want to keep it in the hands of responsible people. Keep it channeled. Keep it quiet. Believe me, Hub, the dollar will hold. Believe me. The system will be fine, providing nobody panics.
It began 8 days ago when a group of Arab investors withdrew billions of dollars from U.S. banks. That, in turn, started a chain reaction on the world money markets. Dollars, pounds, marks, francs, yen. Not one currency escaped. This scene outside a Manhattan bank was duplicated all over the world as people saw their life savings become worthless in a matter of hours. Good evening. I'm George Page in New York, and this is another in our series of reports on the world economic crisis. The growing paralysis of the industrial world has left millions without jobs, without money, and without hope. Crowds of unemployed poured into Washington yesterday. They stood in silent protest before the nation's leaders. At the same time, more than 1 million people packed St. Peter's Square, where the Pope urged calm and nonviolence. The pontiff asked for prayers for world leaders, prayers and peace and reason. But the last 24 hours have been marked by growing protests and ever-increasing violence. Last night, demonstrators burned American currency in front of the White House, and attempts to put out the fires led to a confrontation with police. Every hour, from every corner of the globe, there are new reports of outraged crowds demanding action. A bankrupt world seems to be teetering on the very edge of anarchy.
And now for continued coverage from around the world. A statement was issued from the OPEC meeting today that the leading oil-producing nations would resume oil exports as soon as the international monetary markets have stabilized. The panic has spread across political and